Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chasing Thoughts with Chase. Just a quick thing before we start. This is the first part of three of an episode, technically. Let me explain. So, I originally planned to do summarize the entire Lord of the Rings extended trilogy in one video. However, since I don't want to make a 2.5 hour long podcast episode, I'm instead going to opt to explain one movie at a time and release it in 3 parts over 3 different weeks. And once it's complete, I'll compile all of them together and also release the full unedited version, the full uncut version, well, as uncut as I can get with my stutters and my speech. Yeah. So this video is going to be me reviewing Lord of the Rings Fellowship of the Ring. Just wanted to let you guys know before we get into the video. Anyway, have a good time, everyone, and enjoy this decently made summary. I'm not going to say it's the best, but I'm also not going to say that it's the worst summary ever. Enjoy. Hi there, everyone. Welcome back to Chasing Thoughts with Chase. I know it's been like 2 months since I've made a video, and I'm actually really excited for today's video because I am going to be reviewing the first movie in the Lord of the Rings. I made an intro already about how I'm going to break it down into 3 different episodes. So without further ado, I don't want to waste your time by repeating a point I've already made earlier in the video. Let's just get into the notes. And just so you guys know, I'm not going to show you my notes, but I think there's like a little over 3 pages worth of notes for this one movie alone. So first off, if you guys are wondering about the length of the extended edition of The Fellowship of the Ring, it is around 3 hours and 48 minutes long. And if I'm not mistaken, this is the shortest movie in the trilogy, mind you. Now, an interesting thing I think you guys might want to know is due to the fact that I forgot to take notes the first go around when I was initially coming up with this idea, this is actually the last movie that I took notes of. So, I'm just going to say this. This is a bit of a personal glazing thing, but I really love the introduction scene in the first movie, the prologue scene. It is like one of my favorite scenes in the entire trilogy. The actors just do such a good job doing their roles, especially in this. And it talks about a lot of it basically gives you a summary of the backstory of the conflict for the One Ring. And before the great battle that they talk about, there's a lot of history before this that I could probably make an entire video on this channel or another channel. Okay, but here's a really dumbed down summary for the intro if you have not happened to read or watch it before. I should probably say I am going to spoil basically the entire plot for all 3 movies. So if you have not watched them yet, then at least watch the regular versions before watching this video if you don't want to be spoiled. Anyway, in the world of Lord of the Rings, which is called Middle Earth, by the way, we're going to call it Middle Earth just for future reference, there are special rings of power. And the prologue says that within them resides the will to govern all the races that reside in Middle Earth. Those mostly being elves, dwarf, and men. I know there's a few others that we'll get into later, but those are the 3 most important ones. However, the Dark Lord Sauron essentially creates the One Ring to rule them all. And the One Ring essentially allows him to control anyone who is wearing a ring of power. And using the power of the ring and his other existing powers, he starts going on this quest to conquer Middle Earth because he's an evil dude. But elves and men decide to make an alliance, they have a fight, and they win, but not without some losses. They have to go and destroy the ring, but instead of destroying it, the leader of men, Isildur, that is an important name by the way, decided to keep the ring for himself rather than destroy it. And the ring, and very important context about the ring is that it has a will of its own, so very important to know. And it decided to betray him, so he died. However, it falls into a lake, and for 2,000 years, no one really hears anything about the ring. History becomes myth, myth becomes legend, and it passes out of all knowledge for basically 2,000 years. Until Gollum, decides to take it to the Misty Mountains and keeps it for 500 years. During that time, whispers of a shadow in the east start to grow, and the ring decides, hey, it's time for me to come back to my master. So it decides to abandon Gollum, but this is where the ring did not expect who would pick it up, and that is Bilbo Baggins from the Shire from the Hobbit movies. And I will get into the Hobbit trilogy another time, but just know this is when Bilbo gets an ownership of the ring. So, after explaining this and saying that the fate of all races will soon lie in hobbits, which, by the way, are kind of like a subspecies of men, but shorter, lore-wise, and also they're very... I'm sorry if I'm not making sense. I didn't take the most detailed notes, and these notes were taken like 2 months ago, so... yeah, I'm starting to realize I really should have written these notes sooner or made more details about it. So after the prologue, we get to hear part of the story through Bilbo's perspective. And Bilbo gives us actually a really big lore drop, saying that the movie takes place during the year 1400. And it is at this point I would like to apologize to, I think, 2, maybe 3 people in the YSA, where I said that Lord of the Rings is meant to take place thousands of years before our time. And they said, I think it takes place during medieval time. I was wrong. You were right. Don't trust everything I say, because I don't always do my research before doing this. But I'm willing to admit I was wrong in that conversation. But yeah, Lord of the Rings takes place during 1400s. And Bilbo Baggins goes about explaining how hobbits live. They aren't really the adventurous kind. They care more for peace and quiet, and are content to grow plants and also have good ale. This is something that Bilbo actually mentions during his description. And then the scene cuts over to Frodo, but I'm not going to talk about Frodo right this second. But just know, Frodo is a really, really important character, and he is Bilbo's nephew. Also kind of noticed that due to holding on to the ring for 60 years, which is the gap between the last Hobbit movie and the first Lord of the Rings movie, he has become low-key obsessed with it. Anyway, my favorite character in the entire series, Gandalf the Grey, who is a wizard, decides to come visit Bilbo on his 110th birthday, because that's when, after the prologue happens, this is when it starts, it's his 110th birthday, and greets him as an old friend. So, while he's talking to Gandalf, he mentions that he has plans to leave the Shire and stay with the elves. I really should be explaining stuff like this, because, yeah. And he also mentions that he feels stretched, like butter over too much bread. I'm not sure if I'm doing that acting well, but that's what he says. And Bilbo recounts his... So, basically, I'm going to skip some stuff here, but basically, no, they're setting up... The entire village of the Shire is setting up for Bilbo's party. And while the party's going on, Bilbo's recounting a tale from his time adventuring with the Dwarf Company in The Hobbit. At this point, we're introduced to 2 new characters, Merry and Pippin. Now, Merry and Pippin are what we will call pranksters, and they decide, hey, we're going to set up some fireworks from Gandalf's cart preemptively, because if you don't know, Gandalf is also famous in the Shire for his fireworks. And they end up setting off a huge firework by accident, which almost hits some people, and it's a huge dragon, by the way. It looks really cool, especially with the CGI they had back then. And they get in trouble with Gandalf, and he forces them to wash dishes as recompense. Then after the partying's died down, Bilbo does a speech where he's like, I'm afraid I must go now, and decides to slip on the finger to prank people with it. Which, while he's laughing and is happy about, Gandalf is not, because it immediately makes him suspicious. So Gandalf finds him at his house and basically asks Bilbo to take off the ring, which Bilbo at first refuses and calls it his precious, which is what Gollum called it, and we'll get into Gollum later because he's not really prevalent very much in the first movie. But with Gandalf's help, Bilbo does something that no one else in the series has done up to this point. And that is willingly relinquish the ring. And there's a scene where Gandalf touches the ring. I'm not sure if it's before it or after it. He doesn't put it on or anything. He just like taps it. And the Eye of Sauron just popped up. It jump scared me when I was taking notes for this. So it's at this point that Gandalf decides to leave the Shire to seek answers about the ring after telling Frodo that Bilbo left everything to him. And during his side quest, he discovers that the One Ring holds a secret that can only be revealed by fire. Text written in black speech. Now this right here is around the rough translation that most fans commonly accept. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. And I'm sure there's like a lot of meaning, symbolic meaning behind this specific statement, but I'm not really willing to do any more research than I already have to tell you that. Just know that this statement is important. And after he learns this, he goes back to Frodo, says, give me the ring, throws it in the fire, finds out that it actually is the One Ring, and tells him a bit about the One Ring and the fact that Sauron's life force is bound to it. And then he learns, as if that's not, if Merry and Pippin aren't annoying enough for him, and the stress of knowing that the One Ring is still alive isn't enough. He also learns that Samwise Genji has been Frodo's friend has been eavesdropping on this entire conversation that he's been having with Frodo about the One Ring. And so Gandalf basically forces him to join the quest while he rides to Isengard to consult with Saruman, who's the head of the Wizard Order. And he tells them, okay, go to Bree to the Prancing Pony. I will meet you there once I'm done with my business with Saruman, basically. So while they're traveling, while Frodo and Sam are heading over to Bree, which isn't super far away from the Shire, but it is outside the Shire, we see an entourage of elves. And Frodo explains that the elves are basically leaving Middle-earth to go travel to the Grey Havens. And this will come in important later on in the trilogy, as I said. A lot of the stuff that I'm randomly explaining will come in proof for future videos. So, yeah. After this specific scene, it cuts back to Gandalf with when he talks with Saruman. Basically, Saruman learns that Sauron is gathering an army. And Gandalf's like, well, how the heck do you know this? And immediately the next scene, it cuts to saying that a Palantir is a dangerous tool. So I'm going to explain what a Palantir is, because this Palantir, believe it or not, comes back in the later movies and actually ends up being somewhat important. A Palantir is also known as a seeing stone. And in the old ages, before this entire story happened, it was used for long-distance communication. But somehow, Sauron has gained his hands on one of them, and as of such, if someone has another seeing stone, he can use that to corrupt them, to communicate and corrupt them, which is what has happened to Saruman. And Saruman essentially says, well, you can't beat Sauron, so why not join him? And Gandalf is like, no, I'm not going to betray my order, the promise I made to protect good, because they actually did make that promise, and it's explained more about his origins and whatnot if you read the Silmarillion, which I'm going to only mention the Silmarillion this one time, summarize it. But this is a lore book made by Tolkien, but I don't think it was published till after his death, where it just basically explains a lot of the backstory backstory of Middle-earth in general. Yeah, he's like, I'm not going to go back on my promise, and decides to fight back against. But unfortunately for Gandalf, Saruman is the stronger of the two wizards, and ends up grabbing his staff and using Gandalf's own staff against him. And also, during the process, he gets a concussion courtesy of the room. So, eventually, right as Sam and Frodo are about to leave the Shire, they bump into Merry and Pippin, who decided to steal some food from Farmer Maggot, who's really mad about that. So basically, after this, they fall off into the side of the road, and this is where the party first encounters the Black Riders. Who the Black Riders are exactly, we're going to get into a bit later, but all you need to know is that these guys kind of create a tangible darkness around the area when they first encounter the hobbits, which one makes the scene look really, really cool, but also two is indicative of how powerful they are. They have to end up escaping from the hobbits have to end up escaping from the Black Riders and eventually make it over to a ferry that they can use to cross over to Bree. And thankfully they all make it, and conveniently the next closest crossing is like 20 miles. The Brandywine Bridge, which is 20 miles away from their current location. So basically, they've just bought themselves some time. So they enter, they come into the Prancing Pony, they ask the innkeeper, hey, have you seen Gandalf? And he's like, no, I haven't seen Gandalf in 6 months. Basically saying Gandalf's missing. And I will say that at this point in the story, Frodo is still very new to the whole keep it secret, keep it safe concept with the ring. He very much accidentally slips over, flings the ring in the air where literally everyone in the Prancing Pony can see it, including a hooded man in the shadows who will become super important later. And they all just kind of watch as the ring just goes flings up in the air and just so happens to land oh so perfectly onto his finger. And the ring falls on, and while he has the ring on before he puts it off, Sauron sees him and speaks to him. In fact, if you turn on subtitles like I do, you can actually learn that he says, there is no life in the void, only death. This is what he says to Frodo before Frodo pulls off the ring. And because of that, the Black Riders learn that he is in Bree. And basically, the hooded figure I talked about earlier pulls them over and says, yo, dude, you are really bad at hiding this secret. And during the whole thing, while he's trying to help them, he's like, explains who the Black Riders are. So the Black Riders are the Nazgul. And the Nazgul were once great kings of men, but who inherited the lesser rings of power, who inherited some of the rings of power I mentioned earlier, and were put under Sauron's control by the One Ring's power. And at all times, they sense the One Ring. So if you ever put on the ring, the Nazgul will instantly know where you are. Don't know why that came off during this recording session, but it did. So they go into the hotel, and Strider decides to trick them with pillows while they move out of Bree towards Weathertop. And during this 2-day travel scene, we learn that Frodo is fluent in Elvish, which, again, I would not mention this unless it did not have some form of connection later on in the story. And then it cuts, and then after they do this whole thing, then they travel some more, and something really funny here is the fact that Merry and Pippin are complaining the fact that Strider does not know about Second. By the way, Strider's not his real name. I will reveal his later name later in the movie because it's revealed later to us. And for a brief moment, it decides to cut to Gandalf, who finds himself trapped on top of Saruman's tower in the center of Isengard, who can only watch as Saruman betrays the order and goes and serves Saruman by cutting down a bunch of trees, which again will come in importantly. So anyway, it cuts back to the hobbits and Strider, and they say, "Oh," and Strider basically says, "Make camp here in Weathertop for the night." I'm only saying Weathertop so you guys know where it is, and gives them some blades to defend themselves. So the other hobbits, Merry, Pippin, and Sam, not Frodo, decide, oh, we're going to make some nice midnight breakfast. Which, normally in most cases would not be a bad idea. Get some food in your stomach. Unfortunately, they start a fire to do this, and they conveniently forget the fact that the Nazgul are still chasing after them. So, congratulations, the Nazgul know where you are now. Very, very fun. So, they have to run away, and they run up to the top where the Nazgul find them and surround. And Frodo, for some reason, panics and puts on the ring again, even though he was explicitly told the ring doesn't help you hide from the... And when he puts on the ring, he sees the eerie, true forms of the Nazgul. And trust me, it's like really creepy, and they do a good job of it. And the Nazgul are basically like, give me the ring. And Frodo's like, no. So their leader is like, all right then, I'm just going to stab you with a Morgul blade. And he's like, ah! Anyway, Strider comes in and saves the day with a torch and his blade. He doesn't really use the blade, he just throws his torch on the Nazgul's robes, which set them on fire, which for some reason I find absolutely... How do you beat these eerie wraiths who are great kings long since corrupted? Oh, I know. Fire! I just find that funny. Now, unfortunately, I did mention that the blade was a Morgul blade. And basically, the blade is poisoned with some kind of weird dark power. And if they don't cure Frodo, he's going to turn into a ring. So another character enters the story at this point, and her name is Arwen Evenstar. And she's an elf. The first elf character that we see that's not just the elves leaving for the Grey Havens. And they learn that the only way to get to Rivendell in time, which is where they need to get to so they can get the elvish medicine that Frodo needs, is to go on horseback. And Strider and Arwen briefly have a bit of a thing about who can ride there faster, and they ultimately decide that Arwen should ride ahead so that she can take Frodo to safety. But the Nazgul, as we know by now, are stubborn as heck, and apparently setting their robes on fire is not enough to chase them away from going after Frodo. So there's this whole horse chase scene where Arwen's getting chased by the Nazgul, and she has to barely escape. And eventually, she gets over to a river. And the Nazgul are like, okay, give up this boy to us or we'll kill you. And she's like, yeah, okay, I don't care. Anyway, get washed away by the river spirits or whatever. I don't know. I'm trying to explain this the best way I can with the very limited notes that I took, and the last time I've been seeing any of these movies having been over 2 months. This is part of the fun of it, is that you get to see me try and make a coherent summary and fail miserably at doing so. So, thankfully, Frodo is saved. He made it to Rivendell, and he's cured of the Morgul blade, though it's noted that that injury will not fully heal and will stay with Frodo for the rest of his life. Anyway, Frodo gets a few items to help on his quest from Bilbo, because Bilbo is there. This is where he's staying with the elves, is in Rivendell, and Bilbo gives him a few items. And those items are 1, some mithril armor, and 2, his old sword Sting, which glows blue when orcs are close. So basically, if you see the blade glowing blue, be extra careful. But of course, because Frodo has the ring, and at this point he has the ring on a necklace, so he doesn't risk accidentally putting it on. He briefly attacks Frodo, but he quickly regrets it. And at this point, I'm going to tell you the name of Strider. His actual name is Aragorn, and he's one of the coolest characters in the entire series. So what we learn is that he's actually the heir of Isildur and the true king of Gondor. But for some reason that I'm not entirely remembering in the story, he decided to simply be exiled and become a ranger. And he considers himself weak because of this heritage, mind you, at this point. He's like, I'm weak because of my heritage of the same man who fell to the ring's power all those years ago. Anyway, it's at this point in the story that a council, which includes Gandalf, Legolas, Gimli, and a whole bunch of other people people, Boromir and several others, basically representatives from all the major races in Middle Earth, convene at Rivendell to decide, okay, what are we have the ring now, what are we going to do? And oh, by the way, Gandalf's back. So basically, Gandalf, I forgot to put this in my notes, and as of such, I forgot to how Gandalf is. But we do see Gandalf is in Rivendell when Frodo wakes up, and he basically says, oh, I sent out a little moth to send a message so that the great eagles could help me escape from the tower. And he also has his staff back at this point. I'm not sure if it's the same staff or if... Yeah, but basically Gandalf and a whole bunch of other people who I will mention later on or very soon just say, hey, what do we do with this ring? One of the people, Boromir, who is representing the kingdom of Gondor, says, oh, give the ring to Gondor so we can use it against our fight against Mordor. And Aragorn tells him, that's not going to work. The ring only listens to Sauron. And Boromir goes, well, what would you know of this? What would a ranger know of this? And Legolas goes on this whole rant of, this is no mere ranger. This is where at this point we learn that he's Aragorn and that he's the true king of Gondor. By the way, I'm going to say this right now. I might be getting some of the events out of order here because of the way I wrote down my notes. And I'm sorry if that's the case. And of course, Boromir is annoyed, but he reluctantly... Eventually, everyone comes to the conclusion that the ring is too dangerous to, use at all. So they conclude, okay, we're going to destroy the ring. So Gimli, who's a dwarf, and basically the dwarf representative there, decides, well, I'm going to take the most direct route and hit it with my axe, which causes the axe to shatter, and Elrond basically kind of mentally facepalms and goes, you can only destroy the ring in Mount Doom, because that was where it was created. And you have to go to Mount Doom in Mordor to... And then, at this point, the ring's influence just causes everyone to start arguing with each other. Before Frodo breaks it up by saying, hey, I'll take the ring over to Mordor. Everyone's a bit shocked by this, but it does calm them down, and eventually most of the other people say, hey, I'll help you. Hey, I'll be here to help you out. This finally calms everyone down, and also Sam, Merry, and Pippin say, oh, you going on this adventure? Let me get a taste of that adventure too. I'm coming with you. And eventually the Fellowship of the Ring is formed, which has 9 people. Frodo, Samwise Genji, Merry and Pippin, Gandalf, Legolas, Gimli, Aragorn, and Boromir. There we go. I knew there was one I was missing, but I forgot about Boromir. Because at this point, in order to make it to Mordor, they have to go through the Pass of Cardaras. But unfortunately, there's an annoying little wizard I mentioned earlier who happens to know that they're wanting to go through the Pass of Cardaras. And he's like, well, not if I have anything to say from it. So even though he's a quarter of a continent away, he's just casting a spell to basically destroy the entire mountain. And I also did say that we were going to talk about the fact that Saruman is able to casually bring down a mountain from a quarter of a continent away, and also have his voice heard from that far away, because they mentioned a voice being... Before they say that it's Saruman's voice, they say that there's a fell voice, and a fell voice is a malicious voice. The word fell means malicious or violent. And so they're forced to take a different path. So there's a few options for alternative paths. One, they could try and continue on the Pass to Cardaras, but that will most likely kill everyone because Saruman's causing trouble. 2, they could take the road, the paths of Gondor, but Aragorn doesn't want to do that because it brings them... Boromir suggests, hey, let's go down the roads of Gondor or whatever, and he's like... Aragorn's like, no, that brings us too close to Isengard, which is where Saruman is, and you really want to get closer to the wizard that's currently trying to blow you up from a quarter continent away? And then Gimli says, oh, let's go through the mines of Moria. And Gandalf doesn't verbally express this to everyone else, but he's worried about going through the mines due to a specific thing that resides there. And also Saruman also knows this as well. He knows that Gandalf doesn't really want to go there. But Gandalf says, let's let Frodo choose. And Frodo decides to go through the Mines of Moria. So Gandalf's like, all right then. So they eventually find where the door is supposed to be. And mind you, a gimmick of dwarf doors is that they disappear once you create them. So if their masters die, then there's basically no way to find the door. But they do find the door, and there's a riddle that says, speak friend, and you will enter. Something like that. So Gandalf's trying a bunch of different stuff. It's going on for a while, and he's starting to get annoyed until Frodo suggests, hey, why don't we just say the Elvish word for friend? And surprise, it works. But before they can get in the door, there's a swamp monster. And before you ask me, there's a body of water right next to the cave for some reason. And my mom calls this the most useless scene in the entire fight in the entire series. Like, why is the creature here? Why can't it just simply be they get into the Mines of Moria without having this fight that doesn't really with this creature that doesn't really make a lot of sense to be there in the story. And it's like basically never mentioned again. And also another thing I put on my notes is that Gandalf's low-key mean to Pippin, and it was in reference to the scene where Pippin accidentally clangs a bucket down a well and alerts and wakes up the orcs that are in the mines. And by the way, this is not the reason why he didn't want to go down to the Mines of Moria. Sure, the Mines of Moria suck because it's infested with orcs, but there's something even worse down there. And I just want you to keep that in mind. So, during the ensuing conflict that inevitably comes because the orcs come after them, Frodo gets stabbed for the second damn time in this movie. But luckily he has plot armor this time around, so he doesn't actually get hurt. Technically, it's not that. It's the mithril armor that Bilbo gave him. But with how strong mithril is, it might as well be. So after going outside of the room and fighting them for a little while longer, the orcs eventually decide to dip. And this confuses the party, but this is because a great big fiery beast called a Balrog lives in the cave. And a demon of the old world. And this was what Gandalf was so scared about going into the Mines of Moria for, because he doesn't really want to have to face this thing. Because he knows that no one except for him really stands a chance against this thing. So he tells everyone to run, because that's the only thing you can really do. Eventually, the party heads over to the bridge, where I think probably the most memed moment in the entire Lord of the Rings scene happens. I'm just going to risk copyright and play that one part clip. Yep, he just lets the Balrog fall, but before Gandalf can make it to safety himself, the Balrog's whip just kind of grabs him and drags Gandalf down with it. Frodo is obviously not happy about this because he really likes Gandalf, but Aragorn's like, okay, we gotta keep moving because these hills are gonna be swarming with orcs by nightfall, so let's move it. So their next destination after this is Lothlorien, because they do need some help after, losing probably the most powerful member in their party. The elves at first are kind of reluctant to let Frodo in because of the ring's darkness. But they do eventually allow them to move further into Lothlorien, specifically into the city of Caras-Galadon. I'm not sure if I'm not pronouncing that right. This is where they meet Galadriel, the Lady of Light, who was the same person who was speaking in the prologue of this movie, and she informs them that the quest stands upon an edge of a knife, basically saying, if you mess up anymore, the quest is going to fail and everyone is going to suffer. And later when they leave, she does give them a few items to help on their quest, but beforehand she says, rest and you can leave tomorrow. And of course, during this entire thing, the elves mention that they don't really fully understand the ways of Gandalf or his full purpose, which is very interesting to me. Interesting enough, I guess, that I put it down in my notes. So during their rest there, a couple things, important plot points happen. Sam decides to dedicate a verse of song to Gandalf's fireworks. He doesn't think it does them justice, but I do think it was nice that he put in the effort to even try. And Frodo goes to see Galadriel, who basically has this beer, which is more like a pool of water, and she's like, look into it. Everyone sees something different, look into it. So Frodo looks into it and essentially sees the bad ending of what will happen to the Shire and to everywhere else if he fails his quest and if Sauron gets his way. He also sees the eye briefly before pulling himself out. And he basically asks Galadriel, oh, could you take the ring? And Galadriel is like, yes, I would really like to take the ring. And goes into this whole tangent about what she would do with the ring if she had the ring. Before regaining control of herself, she's like, no, I can't take the ring because I wouldn't be able to handle it. So she says that to be a ring bearer is to be alone. And she reveals her ring because she actually has a ring of power. And by the way, just as a note, each of the 3 elf leaders have their own rings, and they're more powerful than the other lesser rings of power, but they're still but they're still susceptible to the one ring. So eventually they leave with their items. Frodo gets a light, like basically a vial of light that's activated by speaking Elvish, which is useful because Frodo knows Elvish enough to activate it, but this doesn't come into play until later. But basically, it's a magical light, so very useful. Legolas gets a new bow. Merry and Pippin both get daggers. The entire party gets lembas bread, which is supposed to be one bite is enough to feed a fully grown man, even though Merry and Pippin can just eat like 3 or 4 pieces of bread casually. Sam in particular gets a particularly special gift with elven rope. And Gimli does actually get, and this is weird because Gimli is like, oh, I asked for hair from her head. And yes, this is an actual thing Gimli asks for. And Galadriel actually complies with it and gives him it. So he's like, cool, morale boost. So anyway, they rode down the river, but before they leave, some of the elves say, hey, you're being tracked. Go down this river and you might be able to outpace the enemy and prepare yourself for a potential ambush. So anyway, Saruman, it's at this point where it cuts back to Saruman and whatever project he's been working on and why he needs to cut down the forest ram. And he also gives us a huge lore drop about orcs. So orcs were basically once elves taken by the dark powers time has since forgotten. And that's just basically my way of saying it's Silmarillion territory and I don't want to explain it. Twisted and turned over the generations of breeding to become what they are now. And his ultimate project was actually making his own kind of orc called the Uruk-hai to serve him and Sauron. Now, one thing that distinguishes the Uruk-hai from normal orcs is that the Uruk-hai can actually travel in sunlight without having trouble comfortably in sunlight. Because most orcs are like, oh, we don't like the light, we're going to travel in the night. But the Uruk-hai do not have this problem, which makes them exponentially scarier, meaning because now an ambush can happen at any point during the day or night. So basically, a contingent of Uruk-hai is sent out by Saruman saying, hey, bring me one of the halflings unspoiled because he has something important. You can kill the rest. So they're tracking down, while they're tracking down the party, they stop on a shore and say, basically, we're going to continue on foot after this, I think. But then they realize, first off, Frodo's gone. That's a little worrisome. Second off, Boromir is also gone. That's even more worrisome. And Boromir and Frodo kind of have a bit of the discussion. And Boromir's trying to convince Frodo to give him the ring. And Frodo's like, I would, but I get some bad aura around, my intuition is basically telling me this is a bad idea. So eventually it gets to the point where he starts trying to forcibly take the ring from Frodo. And Frodo, panicking, decides to try and put on the ring to try to get away from Boromir, which works, and eventually he goes trying to find Frodo to apologize because he realized the ring took control of him. And unfortunately, as I said, he put on the ring, which means A, the Nazgul know, but they don't actually come for him this time. But unfortunately, B, Sauron also knows where he is. So he's able to eventually wrest the ring away. But this is also around the time where the Uruk-hai find him and start ambushing him. And there's this big battle with the Uruk-hai, and a lot of stuff happens that I'm not really going to get into because it's fight scene stuff, and you'll have to watch the movie, and I want to give you a reason to watch the movies. But basically, here's the summary. Uruk-hai ambush the party. Merry and Pippin get captured by the orcs, trying to distract them for long enough for Frodo to escape unseen. Boromir does unfortunately get fatally wounded over the course of this battle. And at around the end of this battle, Frodo decides, I'm just going to go to Mordor alone. But Sam is like, no, wait, let me come with you. And he jumps in and swims after Frodo. And then he conveniently remembers that he can't swim. So Frodo has to come over and save him. So Frodo and Sam decide, hey, we're going to go to Mordor by ourselves. And then Gimli and Legolas are kind of sad because they're like, oh, Frodo's gone. We can't help him anymore. But then they change objectives and decide, well, Merry and Pippin got captured by the orcs. We're not going to let them die a painful death by that, so we're going to go track them down. They also have a funeral for Boromir, by the way. I keep mentioning stuff out of order so much. But at Boromir's funeral, they do decide, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli decide we're going to go rescue Merry and Pippin. And the movie is over, and we have, get this, 28 minutes of credits. Why? Oh my goodness. Anyway, that was a lot to go over, and that was just the first movie, mind you. I've still got 2 more to do, so I will be releasing those episodes over the course of the next 2 weeks. But thank you for watching this episode of Chase and Thoughts with Chase. If you like this, then subscribe. If you don't have to. Anyway, I'll see you all later.